what has just been announced, and as on the screen before us, our subject this afternoon. Subject this afternoon is, why did Jesus perform miracles? And we don't want to ask the question about whether Jesus did perform miracles or whether the events that the Gospels describe as real. We're going to take that as read. So we're going to take the Gospel accounts of Jesus' miraculous works as inspired by God and as a record of true events that actually did happen. The question that we are going to ask is, why did Jesus do those miracles? What was the reason? What was the purpose for the miracles that he performed? So just before we sort of dive into that subject, first of all, just so that we understand what we mean when we talk about a miracle. So we put on the screen a couple of dictionary definitions of what a miracle is. So Cambridge Dictionary says, an unusual and mysterious event that's thought to have been caused by a god because it does not follow the usual laws of nature. Something similar from Oxford, an act or event that does not follow the laws of nature and is believed to be caused by God. So what we're talking about are things that we would not expect to happen in the normal course of events. They do not obey the laws of science or our normal experiences. They're outside the realms of our normal experience, and they are things that are attributable to a divine power. That's what we mean by a miracle. And I think that that would align with the scriptural use of the word miracle. Okay, so before we look at why Jesus did do miracles, we're going to put up one slide which points out the reasons that Jesus didn't do miracles. We're just going to look at the opposite perspective. So we won't turn to this passage, but Matthew chapter 4 and the first 11 verses are one of the accounts of the temptations of Jesus. So this is at the beginning of the gospel records, just after Jesus has been baptized. And the record tells us that he goes into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days. So he's been given God's power. The Spirit of God descends upon him at his baptism. And immediately after that, he goes into the wilderness. And what happens? Well, I'm sure we're all familiar with the three temptations. Jesus was hungry after being 40 days without food and water in the wilderness. There's one temptation that was that he might make stones into bread. Another one was that he might jump off the temple and rely on God's angels to save him. And the third one, he's taken in vision, as it were, into the top of a high mountain, sees all the kingdoms of the world. And the temptation is that he might claim kingship over all kingdoms at that point in time. And what we find at the beginning of the time when Jesus has the power of God, the power to be able to do miracles, he does not turn the stones into bread. He had power to do that. He could have turned the stones into bread, fed himself, but he doesn't. He doesn't cast himself off the temple to prove to everyone that God's angels will save him. Nor does he take to himself the rulership, the kingship over all the kingdoms of the world, which of course is something that was promised that ultimately he will do. He does not use God's power to perform miracles in any of those three circumstances. He did have the power to do so. God's Spirit had descended upon him when he was baptized, but he didn't do miracles to serve himself. Each of those temptations was a temptation for Jesus to do something that would have been for himself, to provide bread that he might eat, to cast himself off the temple, to show in pride, as it were, that he really was the Son of God, or to preempt God's purpose and take all kingdoms to himself before it was time to do so. He doesn't do miracles to serve himself. And it's also true, and we see this as we read through the gospel accounts, that most of the times when Jesus does miracles, he doesn't want everybody to know all about it. He's not trying to make himself famous, not trying to make a name for himself. That's not the reason he performed miracles. So that's just the main point I want to make here, is that Jesus didn't do miracles for himself. That's not the answer to our question. So why did he perform miracles? Let's get down to our actual question. We're going to divide this up. I think I've got 4 points, and we'll look at each of these in turn this evening. So first of all, we're going to suggest that one of the reasons he performed miracles was to help other people, to help the people he came into contact with. Secondly, as an evidence that the words that he spoke were true, that the revolutionary claims that he made were not the claims of a madman, but he was speaking truth when he made those claims. I'm going to suggest that when people saw the miracles that Jesus did, they were being provided with a foretaste of God's kingdom that was going to come. And lastly, we're going to think about the point that when Jesus performed these miracles, he said it wasn't for himself, but it was to give glory to God. So when Jesus did these things, he made the point that the glory, ultimately the power, resided with God. It was God who was to be glorified because of the things that he did. Right, so let's think about the first of those points. We said the first point, or the first reason why Jesus did miracles, was to do good to other people. So here's a passage from Mark chapter 3. So some of the passages I put on the screen, other ones we will turn up. This one's on the screen. So this is Jesus being challenged by the religious leaders of his day because they didn't want him, or they didn't think it was right that he should heal people on the Sabbath day. And we know that the religious rulers in Jesus' time, they were jealous of him. They didn't trust him. And they were challenging him about doing miracles, signs and wonders on the Sabbath day. They said that's a work, and you shouldn't be doing work on the Sabbath day. So Mark 3, Jesus saith unto them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. So Jesus is ready to do a miracle. He's ready to heal this person who has a withered hand in Mark chapter 3. And he's asking the question, is it right for me to do good or evil? To heal the man is good. To ignore his plight when I can help him, that would be wrong. To save life, or to kill? And of course, ultimately, that's what his enemies wanted to do, was to kill Jesus, whereas he was about helping people even to the extent of saving life. So verse 5, when he looked round about upon them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said unto the man, stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. And so Jesus heals the man with the withered hand. It was something that was good. It was a good deed. And this would, of course, enable the man possibly to be able to work, to earn a living and to sustain himself, which he wouldn't have been able to do quite possibly with the disablement he had. And of course, no social system to look after people like that in those days and those times. So the point is that what Jesus was doing, and he describes it as doing something that was good. Restoring the man's hand was something that was good. Of course, that's just one example of a miracle that Jesus did. There are many other examples, and we wouldn't have time this evening to look at them all, but here's some examples. Jesus gave sight to those who were blind. To those who were deaf, he enabled them to hear. He cleansed the lepers. Those who were lame, he enabled them to walk. He healed those who were mentally ill and gave them minds that were healthy. He gave food to the hungry. And we think of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 and other times when he fed those who were in need of food. And of course, greatest of all, Jesus even brought back to life those who were dead. And what's very clear from these things is that when Jesus walked among the people in Galilee, or when he was in Jerusalem, he was very conscious of the people around him, conscious of the physical ailments they had, as well as their spiritual needs and their other needs, those who were poor and had no food and so on. Jesus was very conscious of what people needed. And we have a word for this, and it's the word that the Bible uses, and it's the word compassion. Jesus showed compassion. He understood that these people had a need. He related to that need, and he showed compassion, not only as a feeling, but he did something about it. He did what he was able to do in many of these cases to help. Let's look at Matthew chapter 14 and verse 14. Okay, so just a couple of examples that just to show that the scripture does use this word compassion, of Jesus' attitude to those around him. So this is a circumstance where Jesus is with among a multitude of people. He's been preaching to them. Verse 14, Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion towards them, and he healed their sick. So in this group of people, he could see those that were in need, compassion, that feeling of empathy, wanting to help them, and so he healed them. One other example, Matthew chapter 15, over the page, and verse 32. Jesus called his disciples unto him and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue now with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I will not send them away fasting, lest they faint in their way. So very practical need. They've been following Jesus, listening to his words. They run out of food, and Jesus has compassion upon them because they have no food. They are now hungry. And this is, of course, an example to us. We can't do miracles. We can't give sight to people who are blind or provide abundance of food to those who are hungry. But we can be conscious of the needs of people around us and do what we can to help them. And in doing so, like Jesus, we are revealing God's goodness, because we recall, don't we, that, or keep in our minds, everything we have, all the benefits we have come from God. God gives us, he's a beneficent God. He gives us everything. Jesus showed the same character. And if we are to be Jesus' disciples, we should do what we can to do good. So we've got another question then. Why should people have believed Jesus? This moves on to our second point, that why should people have believed what Jesus said? So we put a few points on the screen there that show that some of the things that Jesus said were, as we said a few moments ago, were absolutely revolutionary. They were words that you might have said were words of a madman. I am the Son of God, said Jesus. He said that he was the Messiah, the great Savior who was promised in the Old Testament. He said he was the King of the Jews. He stated that he could forgive sin. We saw that in our reading. And he was asking people to leave everything that they had, to leave their lives behind, to completely turn their lives around and follow him and do the words that he said. And why should people believe that those things were true? Any madman could say something like that. Why would we want to go and follow someone who made those claims? And this is another reason why Jesus performed those miracles. They provided evidence that he wasn't a madman, but that he really was the Son of God. For no one other than the Son of God could have done the miracles which he did. He had God's power, and the words that he was speaking were God's words. These miracles, the signs that he did, were an evidence that he spoke the truth. And this is what the apostles say in Acts chapter 2. You men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs which God did by him in the midst of you, as you yourselves also know. So looking back on the life of Jesus, they say God was telling you that this man was his son. He was approved of God. Jesus was approved of God. How? By the miracles and wonders and signs that he did, and evidence that the words that he spoke were not his own words. They were not the words of a madman. The words that when he was calling people to follow him were words that people should give heed to and listen to, because as evidenced by the signs that he could perform. It's interesting to note that as we look through the accounts in the Gospels, Jesus didn't just go around doing miracles willy-nilly to anybody who had a problem or was in need of some help. Jesus, in general, it's true, would only perform miracles on those who had at least some degree of faith. So those who called upon him to help, who trusted that he did have the ability, the power to help, to those who believed that he said who he was. So Mark chapter 6, go over into Mark's gospel accounts, Mark chapter 6 and verse 5. We find him, Jesus, at one point in his ministry where we're told he could there do no mighty work, save that he laid his hands upon a few sick folk and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went round about the villages teaching. So the two ideas there seem to line up, that the people were unbelieving. They did not believe the words that Jesus said, and therefore Jesus was unable to perform many miracles there. He could do no mighty work save heal a few sick folk, as if that was as if it was nothing at all. So where there was no faith, there was no healing. But conversely, we can think of this the other way around, that where someone had a very limited faith, when Jesus did perform a sign, when he did do a miracle, that increased their faith. So if we go over again this time to John, we won't read all the verses there, but John chapter 4. John chapter 4. So this is where Jesus is in Cana, and it's the incident with a nobleman who has a son who is sick. Is at the point of death in verse 47. So verse 48, then said Jesus unto him, except ye see signs and wonders, you will not believe. The nobleman saith unto him, Sir, come down ere my child die. So the nobleman evidently believes that Jesus is able to help. He's pleading with Jesus to do something to help his son. Jesus saith unto him, Go thy way, thy son liveth. And the man believed the word that Jesus had spoken unto him, and he went his way. And then, of course, when he gets home, he finds that the exact time when Jesus had said, Go your way, your son is healed, that was the time when he recovers. So that's in verse 53. So the father knew that it was at the same hour in the which Jesus said to him, Thy son liveth. And he himself believed, and his whole house. And so we see that because he had that grain of belief, that he trusted that Jesus could do something, when he sees the son recover and knows it was at the same moment and realizes that Jesus did that, his faith is even greater. He believed, and his whole household. And so for us, it's exactly the same. We can't see Jesus' miracles physically before us. This was 2,000 years ago, but God provides an account of those miracles for us in the Bible. So in that respect, we can see what Jesus did, and trusting that the Bible to be true, this provides us with evidence for ourselves that Jesus was who he claimed to be, that he was the Son of God. So they're signs to us as well. And also another lesson we can take from this is that without faith, we cannot believe or be healed. Possibly not healed of physical problems, possibly be healed of physical things, but certainly be healed in a spiritual way, in our need for healing from sin and ultimately salvation from death. Without faith, it's not possible for such miracles to be wrought. Okay, so we're going to come to the chapter we took as a reading in Mark 2. So we said that Jesus did miracles for those 4 reasons. So we've seen how he helped other people. We've seen that the miracles were a proof that the words he spoke were true. Here, Jesus was saying the miracles were an evidence of a different thing that he said was true. That when he said he could forgive sins, that was true. So we got the account of the man sick of the palsy. I think some of you were learning about this in Sunday school today, so you're very familiar with these verses. So it's where his friends take him up onto the roof and let him down through the roof, and Jesus heals the man. Let's just think about some of the words that we read in Mark chapter 2. So the first words that Jesus speaks to this man, sick of the palsy, he can't walk, he's disabled, he's on a bed, his friends have let him down in front of Jesus. First words that Jesus says to this man are, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." So if we think about that for a moment, that in some respects is quite an easy thing to say, isn't it? Because how would anyone know whether that man's sins were forgiven? There would be no visible way of seeing, would there, that his sins were forgiven? And so those who challenge Jesus would say, well, you can say that, but we don't believe that you have the authority or the power to forgive sin. So in that sense, to say his sins were forgiven might be regarded as an easy thing to say. And how would you know if it was true? But Jesus' next words to the man are, "Arise, take up thy bed, and go into thy house." And that's a difficult thing to say, in the sense that if you say that and it doesn't happen, well, everyone knows for certain that you're an imposter, that you're a fraud. Because he's saying to the man, be healed, stand up, take up your bed, and the man can't do it. But of course, the man can do it. And evidence that Jesus did have the power to heal. And therefore, if we go back to the other words, of which there's no visible evidence, "Son, thy sins be forgiven," that must also be true. God could heal. They could visually see that. And so that was a proof that when he said, "Your sins be forgiven," that they were also genuine words, that the man's sins really were forgiven when Jesus said that. Okay. Jesus claimed that he was the Son of God and the future King of Israel. Right, let's think about the question that John the Baptist asks of Jesus in Luke chapter 7. Possibly a question that was more for the benefit of John's disciples than for John himself. Luke chapter 7, it's about John, Luke chapter 7 and verse 19. John, calling unto him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, "Art thou he that should come, or look we for another?" The Old Testament scriptures prophesy of a Messiah who was to come. Go and ask Jesus, are you the Messiah? Are you the one that is to come? So what does Jesus do? Does he go back and go to them and say, go back to John and say yes? No. Verse 20 and 21. When the men were come unto him, they said, John the Baptist hath sent us to thee, saying, art thou he that should come, or look we for another? And in that same hour, Jesus cured many of their infirmities and plagues and of evil spirits. And unto many that were blind, he gave sight. And it's almost as though Jesus doesn't even answer them. He just says, come, watch. Verse 22. Then Jesus answering said unto them, go your way and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and to the poor the gospel is preached. Go and tell John about the miracles, the signs, the wonders. They are the evidence that I am who I say I am. I am the one who is to come, as foretold in the Old Testament scriptures. If we think to the Old Testament, think about some of the prophecies we have there. The Old Testament spoke of a time that was to come, future from the Old Testament times, time that was to come, which would be an age where miracles would be performed. And one example of that is Isaiah chapter 35. So this is quite a well-known chapter, Isaiah chapter 35, which speaks about a time when miracles would be done. So let's read some of the verses. Verse 2 tells about the desert rejoicing and blossoming. Verse 3, strengthen ye the weak hands and confirm the feeble knees. Say to them that are of fearful heart, be strong. Fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, even God with a recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. The lame man shall leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out and streams in the desert, and so on. Speaking of a time of miraculous events, Isaiah is looking forward. And this was to be the work of Israel's Messiah. We read those words, don't we? And we think of the kingdom. That's what's going to happen in the kingdom. The desert will blossom, and the highway in verse 8 will be there. But it also talks about miracles that are very similar or the same as the ones that Jesus did in his first coming. And so that provides evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. This is not a complete fulfillment of Isaiah 35. It's not the coming of the kingdom and Jesus reigning, because that's still future. But this was providing a taste of those things. Jesus was giving a small amount of miraculous work compared to the kingdom in that age as an evidence that he was the Messiah. And as we say there at the bottom, in the fuller sense, passages like these in Isaiah 35 anticipate the kingdom of God. But Jesus begins to fulfill that work in a small way when he first came at his first advent. Right, we said another reason for Jesus doing miracles was so that glory might be given to God. So we've got two examples on the screen. First one is when Jesus turns the water into wine. It's the first miracle that's recorded in John's Gospel, John 2, verse 11. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee and manifested forth his God's glory, and his disciples believed on him. So we said at the beginning, didn't we, that Jesus didn't do miracles for his own fame, to make a name for himself. He always attributed the glory, the power to God. And so when Jesus turned the water into wine, it tells us that Jesus was manifesting God's glory. This was God's work, and he told people to give God praise for this and other miracles that he did. Or Matthew chapter 15, verse 31, insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to behold, the lame to walk, and the blind to see, and they glorified the God of Israel. And why did they do that? Because Jesus told them this was God's work. He was sent by God. He was performing God's work. God had given him the power to do this. And so they were right to glorify the God of Israel. He was giving glory to God. He was the power behind these miracles and works that Jesus did. So we said, didn't we, when we looked at Isaiah 35, that chapter ultimately is to be fulfilled at the time when God's kingdom will come upon earth. So we saw Jesus making the dumb to speak and the lame to walk and so on. And that proved that he was the Son of God. But it was also a glimpse for people of his day and for us of what the kingdom of God will be like. So just put one passage on the screen here. This is from Revelation 21, right at the end of the Bible, which tells us or gives us an insight into what that time will be like for those who are blessed to inherit the kingdom. I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And this is a picture, isn't it? It was in Jesus' time, it was a small picture of the kingdom, that for those few people whose lives he touched, their tears were wiped away. He took away their sorrow and their crying and their pain, and even released some people from the bonds of death. It's a small taste of what will happen in the age to come. This will be true for all people. That those sorrows and difficulties and pains associated with sin will be removed from the earth. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And so there is the future miraculous age of miracles, the future age of the kingdom, when these things will be done, when God will have compassion for the needs of all his children in that kingdom. So just to summarize what we've said this evening, we said that the works that Jesus did, the miracles that he did, they were good works. And we've seen how Jesus showed compassion. He demonstrated his empathy, his feeling for the people around him, those who were in need and those who were suffering, and used miracles to relieve their needs and their suffering. We've seen also that when Jesus performed miracles, that was him establishing that the words he spoke were true. So the doctrines he taught were true. And also the claims that he made, those signs showed that he was, for example, the Son of God, the Messiah, the future King of Israel. In all of the miracles that Jesus did, the glory was to be attributed to God. And we've also seen or suggested how, when he performed those wonderful works, that was a foretaste for the people of his day and for us of the kingdom. So we see in those miracles how, when he performed them, he was restoring the order and the beauty and the goodness that God had intended in his creation. And of course, when he comes to heal the world, that will be so much more true, that what God intended from the beginning, a world full of order and beauty, and glorifying and praising him, will be what comes to pass. But thank you for your time.